Good morning, class! Welcome to the Spring 2017 Review Session 4, Introduction to Media, 04, 189, 102, Section 01. I'm Steve Miller. You knew that. People in this building knew that, and everybody else knows that. This is going to be the review session, and we're going to go over all of the lectures and the material for the final exam. The final exam will be given to you in Scott 123 on Wednesday, May 10th at 8 a.m. I know those are words that just send shivers up and down your spines, but that's what we have to do. Remember, bring your own pencils. I will not be supplying pencils. If you answer in pen, you're out of luck. Just a reminder that I'm coming to you live, or if you're seeing this later on, live on tape or live on internet, from the RUTV studios. And I want to thank everybody at RUTV for helping us out here. You can send in your questions to me via Twitter at hashtag at WakeUpRutgers. I'm trying to get it and look at the screen and trying to get that to you. Please send in your questions, any questions about the material or any questions about anything. I'm very happy to answer them for you. I'm going to be here for the next 2 hours with, I guess, about a 10-minute break somewhere in the middle, talking to you about the material for this test. Again, the test will be 100 questions, multiple choice and true, false on all the material since the last exam. So it's not cumulative. Also, after this is done, if you have any questions, I will be available on email during my office hours, and the staff members will be there also to help you out. Okay, so let's get started. The first lecture we're going to go over is First Amendment and government regulations. Now, let's keep something in mind, and I said this in class, and I want to stress it unbelievably, even more. And if you were privileged enough to watch the White House Correspondents' Dinner the other night, where Hassan Minhaj talked about the value of the First Amendment, and everybody there, Woodward and Bernstein, talked about the value of the First Amendment, you understand that what separates us from every other country in the world is the First Amendment. It's the part of the Constitution that enables us to have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. But that is something that people think is almost a guarantee. Please change. However, as we said in class, the First Amendment allegedly prohibits federal regulation of the speech and press, yet the Communications Act of 1934 and the Telecom Act of 1996 have imposed federal regulations. So, as I mentioned in class, it's not that you can say anything or do anything. Don't change it yet.
I didn't change it. It's here.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. That doesn't guarantee it that you have absolute freedom of the press and freedom of speech. So, for example, as Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, you don't have the right to yell out fire in a crowded movie theater. If you do that, then you're doing something that shouldn't be happening. But now it also comes down to that you have to break it down to the way that the court systems have imposed regulation and imposed the law on different types of media. So the publishers of newspaper own the press and the paper. That means they have a different set of standards than the broadcasters who use the broadcasting spectrum, which we, the public, own. They look at it as something called a public trust, that we're enabling our elected officials to govern our stations, our airwaves. Now change. These two decisions that we discussed in class, Red Lion and Tornillo, dealt specifically with the differences between broadcast and newspaper or print. Now, before I go over this, I want to remind all of you that these decisions, which were made in 69 and 74, may not be the law today, but when we go over them, it's giving historical context to their impact on media and their impact on our society. So, as we've talked about, the Red Line decision ruled that the FCC's rule entitled people attacked on broadcast to reply was legal and just, which meant that if my friend Dan, who is here in the studio with me, is running for office against my friend Z. We're just going to use short because we're such friends. We have to do that. And I announced that I am supporting Z for the office against Dan. I have to give Dan equal time on the station, and that broadcasters are required to do this. So that's with broadcasting, over-the-air broadcasting. Remember, not cable, not internet, over-the-air broadcasting, traditional media, versus the Tornillo decision, which in 1974 the courts ruled that newspapers do not have to give the space to reply, that the people who owned the press, the publishers, own the press, they own the paper, and what you're really, in a sense, doing when you buy a newspaper is leasing or paying for the right to read somebody else's material. Now, there's a very easy way to remember the difference between this. Red Lion, broadcasting, yes to reply. Tornillo, newspaper, no to reply. Again, Red Lion, broadcasting, yes to reply. Tornillo, newspaper, no to reply. Change, please. Now, both of these fall under the auspice of something that is known collectively as the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine, which was in effect from 1949 to 1987, was put in by the federal government, by Congress, to level the playing field for our democratic way of life. It had various different doctrines involved, various different regulations and rules that really tried to equalize everything for everyone. Now, again, this was repealed in 2000, and all language about it was removed in 2011 after a very important decision that was made called Citizens United by the Supreme Court, which is one of the articles that you have in your litany of articles you need to know, in which the Supreme Court ruled by 5-4 that corporations were people too, and that corporations could blast the political environment with as much money as they wanted to, and that really threw out all fairness. Now going back to the Fairness Doctrine itself, it mandated that broadcast networks devote time to contrasting views on issues of public importance. And we're going to talk about what that means in a couple minutes. But the most famous provision from this was something called the Equal Time provision, which Citizens United would blow out of the water anyway. Equal Time said that if I at WSAM sold 10 minutes of time for 10 commercials to Dan, I had to do the same 10 minutes and offer it to Z's campaign for that too. And it said that the equivalent opportunity to any opposing political candidates who requested it. Now, the personal attack rule also came from the same thing really that led to Red Lion, and then political editorial rule also. Personal attack rule said that stations have a duty to inform individuals or groups of personal attacks, and the political editorial rule said the candidate must be given a chance to respond when a licensee or station endorsed an opponent. Now, the reason I also bring this up is there's some big-time move, especially in light of the election of President Trump, for the Fairness Doctrine to be brought back. There's a snowball's chance in hell of that happening, but it's something that you need to know about because there's a move once again, for an enlightened electorate to demand for an equal and level playing field for all candidates and for all media to participate in this. A lot of the cable media are against this because they feel that every time they criticize the president or they criticize President Obama when he was in office, that would require equal time for somebody else. Of course, the rules can be written in such a way that this type of automatic reply isn't necessary, but it should be part of our system. Change. Now, of course, just as in any law, there are exceptions to the rule. So, for example, the idea of what is of public importance is not decided by the government. It's not decided by Congress. It's not decided by the FCC. It's not decided by the courts. It's determined by the station itself. So if I believe, as the owner of a station, that saving the environment is not an idea of public importance, well, then I don't have to give equal time to it. So, that was written into the law. Fairness also dealt with the overall programming of the station, not just one issue. So if, for example, we're dealing with the environment and a station comes out and says, let's burn all the trees down, and somebody wants to come to the station and the station agrees, then somebody who files a complaint against the station would probably lose out because it's not just my overall programming, it's just the one issue. So you have to do that. And equal time didn't always mean equal time. If, for example, if there was an issue that happened and I interviewed an incumbent senator who was running for office against somebody who wasn't in office at that time, I did not have to give the opposition candidate equal time on my station. So these are important exceptions to the rules. But understanding the First Amendment and understanding government regulation also deals with other issues, such as the public's right to know versus personal privacy. In this day and age of gotcha journalism, in this day and age of the cacophony of noise, how is it that we know the line, or do we know the line, between what is a public person's life and a public person's private life? So you may get somebody like Britney Spears. Do we really have to know, or is it our right to know that she tied her child to the top of a car mistakenly, or that she shaved her head, or any of these other things? Do we really need to know what Beyonce's doing every minute of every day and what the sex is of the child? There are things in there that really, I guess, would confound most normal human beings, but because these are celebrities and people think they have the right to know, it might not be the right to know versus the need to know. So that's something there. A lot of the rulings and the rules about what is the public's right to know versus personal privacy and what a responsible media are about goes back to one law and one ruling. And that ruling is in the case of the New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964, in which Sullivan sued the Times saying that the Times was printing articles meant to undermine his credibility, meant to undermine his ability to serve. And eventually got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that the Times was in the right here because a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. But the key wording in this, the key verbiage in this, was that the court said that in order for Sullivan to have proved that the New York Times was in the wrong, they had to prove that the Times went after him, quote, with deliberate malice, which means that the Times had to premeditatedly decide that they were going to go after Sullivan and undermine him. And they ruled that. This has become the standard by which these types of suits and these types of rulings have been made. So when you talked about all these different cases, including 60 Minutes and William Westmoreland and all these others, that's where the bar was set. Now, originally this dealt with Sullivan and this ruling dealt with politicians. As time has gone on, it has gone to deal with celebrities. So there was a famous case dealing with the comedian and variety show host Carol Burnett back in the 1980s, where the National Enquirer printed that Burnett was so drunk one night that she crawled across the floor of a Los Angeles restaurant and vomited on the shoes of Henry Kissinger, the ex-Secretary of State. It was proved to be a lie. Burnett won millions of dollars in money, and ironically and beautifully, she gave the money to start the School of Journalism at the University of Hawaii. Another case, which we discussed in class, dealt with the Reverend Jerry Falwell versus Hustler magazine and its publisher, Larry Flynt. Now, I'm not going to go over word by word, as we did in class, the fake advertisement, the parody that Flynt published in Hustler magazine, because it's not appropriate for the airwaves. But suffice it to say, Flynt in this parody wrote that the Reverend Falwell, who was the head of the Moral Majority and the founder of Liberty University, that he had somehow slept with his own mother in an outhouse in Lynchburg, Virginia. And on the bottom of this ad, it said, ad parody not to be taken seriously. Falwell, who didn't, let's put it this way, we'll say it nicely, like the fact that Mr. Flint was saying these things, sued and won in every single court and until it got to the Supreme Court, where by unanimous 8-0 verdict, the Supreme Court said, quote, that proof of emotional distress, even with bad motive, can't protect public figures from satirical assaults, no matter how outrageous. This is the same type of ruling and free speech that went into the court's ruling that the Nazis could march in Skokie, Illinois in 1979, or enables me or you to say what we want to say in terms of criticizing the president of the university or the president of the United States. And it's important to understand that that's what the First Amendment does. As Professor Tom Cafferty, one of my former colleagues, once said, the speech that we have to treasure the most is the speech that we resent and hate the most. And that's a pretty good idea. That's what the First Amendment is about, and that's what we're going to go to, please. One more. Thank you. But this is not just something from the 1980s. This is something about the public's right to know versus personal privacy that is even in effect today and has an impact today. In 2016, professional wrestler Hulk Hogan, the same guy said, okay, brother, what you have to do is say a prayer, take your vitamins, talk to the man upstairs. Sued Gawker for publishing a tape of him, and literally, he was sleeping with his alleged best friend's wife, and his best friend was named Bubba the Love Sponge. There's something kind of weird about that. Bubba the Love Sponge was a disc jockey. Don't give me that look, see. Hogan's lawyer argued that the publication of the video was a gratuitous invasion of privacy and no news value, and that served only as a fodder for reader clicks and a source for advertising revenue. And the court awarded Hogan $115 million and $25 in punitive damages. But it's not just that. It drove Gawker out of business and forced Gawker to put itself on sale, and was bought by, I believe it was Univision or Telemundo, one of those. But the lawsuit raises questions about what goes on the internet. And the internet is a wild west where nobody knows what that line is anymore. And the question is, how can you regulate it, especially when it is really still the World Wide Web and things are going on out there. But what's the line between privacy and free expression, slander, libel, all these things that people talk about and discuss having to do with media? What is the normal or the norm in terms of dealing with media? And that's where it still comes in. So again, these things that we're talking about in the 80s and prior to that are still in effect today, and that's part of the great thing with the First Amendment. The other important thing dealing with the First Amendment comes down to what happens when amendments clash. So what happens when the right to have a fair trial under the Fourth Amendment, a fair and speedy trial by a jury of our peers, versus a free press clash? And what takes precedence? The Supreme Court, to this day, the highest court in the land, still does not believe in bringing cameras into the courtroom because it feels it undermines the sanctity of the court and that the lawyers will play to the cameras. The step forward in the past year that the Supreme Court has made has been to put the court filings online. Now, there have been many, 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 many cases in the past 30 years that have shown and demonstrated that cameras do play a role, or that the media can play a significant role in the outcome of a trial and whether or not it's fair and a good trial. The two cases I refer to are from the 1980s and 90s, but you could go with almost any court case now that's televised on TV. I refer to the case of New York State versus Joel Steinberg because it was the first case in the New York City area which had some broadcast component to it. Again, Steinberg was a New York City lawyer who, when he was arrested and he was in a cocaine-induced haze, they found his common law wife had a nussbaum beaten to within an inch of her life, and he had been doing that with free weights, and one of their illegally adopted children dead and the other one chained to a radiator. So when The press covered it. They saw Nussbaum's face. The headline New York Post said the lion-faced woman. She had what we called a Jewfro back then with the big curly hair out here, but her nose was pressed in and she did look like a lion. When the case finally went to trial, Nussbaum's testimony was put on TV. They took off all the soap operas on the local New York stations, and people were mesmerized. And thus, this was born. Eventually, Court TV came along and started carrying trials all the time. But the big case, which is called the case of the century, of course, of the 20th century, was the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, OJ. Now, in the past year, movies and documentaries about this trial and the life of Orenthal James Simpson have won Academy Awards, they've won Emmy Awards, documentary awards, and so on. And I encourage you to go watch them. What happened with that trial, though, was that it was wall-to-wall coverage of even the littlest thing involving the case. And it enabled people to see what was going on in the courtroom and all the various games that were being played. But many times during the trial, the defense would ask for a mistrial to throw the case out. And by doing so, the question was, if the judge had thrown it out, and Judge Ito never did throw it out, would Mr. Simpson have been able to get a fair trial at a retrial? And that's the big question that everybody asks when these two amendments clash. Now, here's the question I keep getting. Well, with these First Amendment things, what does it mean, in terms of our law and our everyday life? Well, the laws that are passed that are within the realm of the Constitution are the legislative decisions that are passed by Congress. The Congress is the only one that can pass laws. The president signs it. Yes, there's your political science for today. And we talked about three different acts. The Radio Act of 1927, which formed the Federal Radio Commission. The Communications Act of 1934, which formed the Federal Communications Commission, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the Telecom Act of 1996, which was an amendment to an addendum to the Communications Act of 1934. Now, the discussion about whether or not there should be regulations and rules of media is one that has continued since 1934, and it continues to this day. And some would argue that not just with media, this is a discussion we're having every single day, which is, what is the role of government? People who are in favor of regulation of media believe that something called a scarcity factor exists. Keeping in mind, especially in broadcast, that the government really rules over the-air networks, and that public trust requires the government to be in charge of that. The scarcity factor deals with the broadcasting spectrum, and it says that, or at least if you believe that in these regulations, that there is a finite space on the broadcasting spectrum from which these stations could be broadcast. And that it's the government's job to supervise the use of that spectrum and to regulate it. The people who are against regulation say BS. They call BS on that. They say that there is not a scarcity factor with cable and with internet and with low power and all these other ways of and in your case, Netflix, Hulu, Vudu, that thing you do, whatever it is. You just run the gamut on all this. So they argue that the government should get the hell out of the way and let the strong companies survive and let the weak ones go away. Again, as I told you, this is a form of social Darwinism. Whereas, again, let the social Darwinism, letting the strong survive and let the weak and companies that are unable to stay on their feet to go out of business and get out of the way. It's a very important thing to talk about, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more later. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is the regulatory body in charge of what goes on in media. There are 5 members on the FCC. Only 3 can be from the same political party. The marching orders under the Communications Act of 1934 for the FCC are that it should, quote, serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. However, nowhere in there is there a definition of what serves the best way to serve the public interest or the convenience or what's necessary. Is the public interest of New Jersey the same as it is in Mississippi? The FCC has become a body used for political purposes to serve both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, and serve the people they want to serve. Right now, there's a brand new head of the FCC, and he is trying to get rid of net neutrality because that serves his party's supporters. He's a Republican member there. The Democratic head of the FCC did the same thing, but in terms of enforcing laws and regulations the way they want. There's an article that is in the New York Times today, as a matter of fact, that talks about the move by the FCC to loosen regulations on ownership numbers. And I'm going to get into that in a minute. But the FCC has prevented legitimate sales of stations because of lobbying by interest groups. They approve requests for regulation and enforcement based on which party is in power and which one has the 3 out of 5. Right now, the Republicans are very quickly switching over to what they want to do with it, a more business-oriented thing, versus what the Democrats want to do. Again, I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong. I'm just telling you what it is. Change. But the most famous part about the FCC is how they deal with content. You don't hear about as I showed you in class, the boring, as John Oliver points out, the boring FCC meetings discussing arcane and archaic regulations and rules. But where the FCC's most power in people's mind comes from is from content rulings. And this goes back to a case called the FCC versus Pacifica Foundation in 1978. As I explained in class, in the early 1970s, a man was driving down the Long Island Expressway with his young child at about 2:30 in the afternoon when he turned on WBAI in New York, WBAI, which was owned and run by the Pacifica Foundation. And on the airwaves was a comedy bit by the late, great George Carlin. And the bit was called the seven words you can't say on television. I'm not going to say those words. I'm not even going to do the initials now. Again, not proper for this audience. But they played this bit. The man wrote a complaint to the FCC. The FCC took Pacifica to court. And after a few years, won. But they didn't win based on the allegedly obscene content. They won based on time of day. Or as the court held that, words need not be obscene to warrant sanctions. Audience, medium, time of day, and method of transmission are relevant factors in determining whether to invoke sanctions. This was the mantra for the FCC for years and years and years and years. It led to eventually to TV stations using it to their own advantage, or TV networks, such as the ABC television network back in the 80s and 90s, and maybe even the 2000s, had TGIF television, where you had shows like the original Boy Meets World, as opposed to Girl Meets World, which I hear is terrible. Boy Meets World, Urkel, and all those shows. The ruling in 1978 was also used again by the FCC in 2003 when, during a broadcast of the American Music Awards, the singer Cher and the singer Bono from the group U2 both dropped F-bombs on live TV where there was no delay, and the FCC fined Fox $225,000 per station that broadcast this alleged infraction, and Fox took FCC to court. Now, originally in 2009, the Supreme Court upheld the decision, but when it came back after Fox did the repeal, it was overturned. But it had nothing to do with the content. As it says here on the screen, as Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote, the commission policy in place at the time of the broadcasts gave no notice to Fox or ABC that a fleeting expletive or a brief shot of nudity could be actionably indecent. What that means is they they just stepped out of the way and said, throw out the fines, but I'm not going to make a ruling, because if I make a ruling, that becomes law. If that becomes law, then it causes another whole bad cornucopia of problems. Now, media deregulation came into effect really starting with the Reagan administration in 1981. As I've said before, prior to 1981, media was not just about business. It was also about keeping a level playing field and about having a democratic media system. But under the Reagan administration and their adherence to social Darwinism, they deregulated ownership limits. They repealed ownership limits. They, as I've mentioned before, and we'll talk about that again, they lengthened license terms. Back in those days, over-the-air TV stations had 3-year licenses that had to be renewed every 3 years, and over-the-air radio stations had licenses that were 5 years. They eliminated required program logs. If you remember, we talked about this also in the advertising lecture in the second part of the semester, and I said that stations were not required to use program logs, but they still use them as proof of performance in terms of making good on their commercials. The regulations that were also repealed, commercial limits. There used to be a finite number of commercials that could be shown during a program. That limit was lifted. Excuse me. They also lifted ascertainment requirements and non-entertainment requirements. Those were the public affairs program choices that the stations were making in order to get their FCC licenses. Those were sent out. The rule, though, that I feel really had an impact with its elimination was something called the trafficking rule. The trafficking rule stated, and this is extremely important, that if a radio or television license and station were sold, the new owner had to hold on to that license or that station for a minimum of 3 years. When this was eliminated, then stations could be bought and sold left and right at any time in any place. So the elimination of this helped set forth the merger media madness of the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and the consolidation that we have now. Combine this with the repealing of the ownership limits, and you get the environment we have now. Now, the old ownership rules included a 777 rule, which meant that no owner could own more than 7 AM, 7 FM, or 7 over-the-air TV stations. And those 7 over-the-air TV stations could not reach more than 25% of all households. That later became 12, 12, 12, and then 18, 12, 12, and now it's at the ruling that we have today, which we'll go over in a minute. These other regulations, which I told you were just background, included broadcast networks cannot own cable systems, but only cable programmers. Local TV stations could own cable systems in their own direct viewing area. Newspapers could own cable systems anywhere, but not a television station in the same city. That regulation, by the way, got in the way of the founding of Fox Network because Rupert Murdoch and News Corp owned the New York Post, and they had to sell off the New York Post for 5 years until they got a waiver 5 years later in 1990 to have both. And then Television Network could not own 2 stations in the same viewing area. Please change. Now that has all changed. Radio ownership, market with 45 or more, you can own 8 stations. In New York and around the country, and you can go down this list, you don't have to know those numbers. Clear Channel Communications owns over 1,600 radio stations. They dominate markets with what they own. And it's absolutely amazing. TV is now limited to reach 39% of all households. But referring back to the article I read this morning, this past week, the FCC, under its new regime, loosened certain parts of the regulations. So there were exceptions made to the rule that enabled individual owning companies to own stations that reach more than 39% of the country, but only some of them count. So the current chair of the FCC and the Republican-led FCC, and again, this is not, please do not take this as a political statement. This is a factual statement that the Democratic head of the FCC resigned when the new Republican administration came in, and policies have changed. And it's just a fact of life. and that now they're playing with the rules that are already on the books to enable companies to own more than what is allegedly stated as the cap on stations. So now Sinclair Broadcasting, Nexstar Broadcasting, Fox are looking into ways to buy over-the-air television stations that reach more than 39% of all households, even though that's what the regulation is. But the rules have been, let's say, I'll call it massaged to change that. Broadcast licenses are now 8 years instead of 3 or 5. And then a company can own both a newspaper and either a television station in one of the 20th largest markets, and so on. In terms of ownership of number of TV stations in one market, that's changed also. You can now own as many as 3 stations in one market as long as one of them isn't in the top 4 in the local ratings. In fact, one of the subjects of this new ruling that I read about this morning is Channel 11, owned by Tribune Media. Fox is looking to purchase Tribune Media, and if they do, News Corp, owner of Fox, they will then own 3 of the 6 big commercial stations in the New York City market, which means one owner has 50% of the voice. That is abhorrent. That is anti-democratic. That is something that needs to be changed. And you can argue that, well, this has nothing to do with you, but it has everything to do with you because a free media is what we're supposed to have in terms of a democracy, a way to express more than just one point of view. So that's fine, done. Go past that. The question is that at the end there is, where are the regulators in terms of all these big deals that are listed here on the chart? You don't have to know these deals, but just know that you have, and we're going to talk about this again in the cable lecture, you have these big companies owning all the properties out there and thus reducing the number of voices that are out there. Okay, thank you. The next thing we're going to talk about is public broadcasting. This is another part of our media that is in deep, deep, deep trouble. There is, under the new budget proposed by the Trump administration, they have proposed that all funding for public broadcasting be eliminated. Oh, okay. That's interesting. I guess this is the old stuff. When you think of public broadcasting, you think of opera, alternative programming, Ken Burns documentaries. Did you guys watch the Civil War when you were in high school or middle school? You should have. Ken Burns did this whole documentary that they usually put on every year when they want to raise money. That's probably one of the greatest documentaries of all time, and revolutionized. It was a 9-part series on the Civil War that went into depth and detail that was never there before, or a NewsHour. But the question is, will you ever be able to see these shows again once funding is cut? I'm not going to call up the Elmo video. For those of you who are out there, Google Elmo getting let go or Elmo loses his job. One of the comedy group out there had Elmo, and I showed this in class, brought Elmo in and told Elmo with the cuts to public broadcasting he was losing his job. And he asked the question, well, what's Elmo to do? Of course, the answer was, well, you can always go to Times Square and get tips. But what do you do when you don't have Sesame Street? What do you do when all funding for public media has been left off the budget? Also, Sesame Street itself is now property of not just PBS, but a pay subscription network, HBO. And they get the first run programs. But what does this all mean for the future of public media? Where will the money come from to keep public media running? What will happen to the government? What will happen to the people of this country when it's an unlevel playing field in which certain people who have money have access to knowledge, when people who don't have money have no access to knowledge? If you talk, back in 2010, 2011, you heard about Occupy Wall Street and the 99% versus the 1%. Well, what happens when this occurs is that you end up with a 1% having the knowledge because they can afford to pay the extra money for high-speed internet, or they can get access to HBO and Sesame Street. And then you have the people who can't afford that, who don't have that knowledge. So we create a bigger gap in society, and a bigger, not just knowledge gap, but a bigger economic gap, because you need you need education in order for people to advance themselves. But Sesame Street itself changed how you watch TV. It changed American education as we know it. But as I told you in class, I only find it to be 80% successful. And the reason I did that was the question of, does it raise expectations too high for young people? When I was in school, when I was in kindergarten, we went to a half-day kindergarten, had no homework, and the best part of the day, of course, was having graham crackers and milk, and we got to play, and we try and stay away from the sandbox until they check to see if any cats had gone through. But that's another story. So what Sesame Street did was it changed the way education was done, but it changed the expectations of education. And I gave you a couple of examples. One was my daughter. My daughter, class of Rutgers, class of SAS class of 2011, thank you, went to preschool to age 2.5, and the first day she was in the preschool, she went in, and I left her there. I came back in, and the teacher, Miss Marsha, when I came back that day, I said, how'd my daughter do? And she said, she's the smartest kid in the class. And I resisted the temptation to go, of course. And then I said, well, what makes her the smartest kid in the class? And Miss Marsha said, without missing a beat, she knows all her letters and her numbers. And I said, that doesn't make her smart. 2 reasons. One, she's a vidiot. She watches television day in and day out. You can't get her eyes off the TV screen. And so she watches Sesame Street incessantly. Number 2, she has an older sister who teaches her, who says, okay, let's count. And my daughter will start counting, going 1, 2, and her older sister will start screaming at her, it's 3 afterward, 3, you have to do it. And she would just do that all the time. And so she doesn't know what A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P means. She doesn't know what 1, 2, 3 means. What she does is she repeats what she's been told. But that creates that expectation. So there's an expectation now, whereas I had the expectation to be able to use the building blocks, maybe. Students today who go into kindergarten are expected to know how to read. They're expected to know how to possibly add and do all their numbers. But some of them may not be capable of doing that. This also got into our school system and our expectation system. My mother-in-law was an educational consultant, and she was helping people with their standardized test studying. And somebody called her up and said, I'd like you to help my child with their standardized test studying. And my mother-in-law said, oh, is it for the SATs? I said, no. GREs? No. What's it for? The pre-SSATs. What's the pre-SSAT at the time? And maybe even today? That's the test you take in order to get into a good kindergarten to get the kid on the fast track to Harvard. It's ridiculous. But Sesame Street did that. And the final thing that I always mention to you is, do you remember having wheelie book bags in middle school? Why did you have wheelie book bags? Because the books were too heavy and they brought down the curriculum. And all this influx of AP courses with college books that are this thick coming in there when you're in high school comes back because Sesame Street took everything down 2 grades. But it did melt TV successfully. It did teach you how to do it, and it did change American education. So we have a brighter public now. Public broadcasting started out as educational broadcasting. In 1945, the FM band, radio band, was reallocated with 20% of all channels dedicated for education. This affects you even today. Not here in terms of RUTV, because cable is a newer entity, but in terms of your radio stations. WRSU, the voice of Rutgers, 88.7 on your FM dial. The Core, WVPH, on the Livingston campus, 90.3 on your FM dial. were within that 20% of the band between 88 and 92 on the dial, where that was reserved for educational purposes. A lot of the NPR stations are also in that part of the dial, on that part of the dial. So again, this 71-year-old, 72-year-old regulation is something that still impacts you here at Rutgers University today. In 1948, as we've discussed, it seems in your minds, ad infinitum, there was a freeze put on TV. Going back, you don't need to know this, but the freeze was put in because they felt that the demand for equipment was outdoing the supply for equipment, and that they needed to redistribute geographically the license for television stations. 4 years later, 4 years later, the Sixth Report and Order came out. And if you remember the Sixth Report and Order, which we mentioned during the original television lecture, there were three parts of it you needed to know. One was that the number of stations increased from 12 to 82, from just the VHF, very high frequency, to include UHF, which is 1483. Second one was the number of viewing communities was increased from 345 to 1,291. And I said the third part was going to be reserved for educational purposes. And you said, what was that for? And you said for public broadcasting. And you were correct, my friend. And that 20%, which equaled at the time to 242 channels, was set aside for educational purposes. But being the government is what it is and does what it does, wouldn't be for 10 years, it wouldn't be till 10 years later that the first federal funding was implemented. What did this mean? It meant a lot, because without funding, you don't get good television. I gave you the example from my own life about this. My father used to tell my mother that he thought I was insane, thought I was crazy, because I would run around, and the example he always gave was that I would run around the house going, "Ickatic, ickatic, ickatic." And he would say, "Joan, the boy's nuts." "Ickatic, ickatic." "Joan, did you drop the boy on his head?" "Ickatic, ickatic." "Joan, where do we go wrong?" I don't know. Until one day he saw me sitting this far away from the TV, and a show came on, and it was on PBS, and it started out with the French national anthem, which goes, the Marseillaise. And then in very bad graphics for today, in front of a old black, it was in black and white, map of Paris, it said, "Parlez-vous français?" And the camera wheeled or panned to a woman in a big black bouffant hairdo, looking at the camera and saying, "Bonjour. Bonjour. 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 Écoutez." Ickatic, ickatic, ickatic. And for those of you who know French, écoutez means listen. But that was the entire show. The woman just staring at the camera for a half hour, speaking into it. Now, one could argue, by the way, that what I'm doing right now is that same thing. And you'd be right. But I'm doing this in front of a beautiful background. As you can see, that is computerized. It's not a bad map of Paris. And as you've seen, the PowerPoints change, and we get that because Rutgers University has deigned to invest money in this wonderful facility, a mighty facility, a great facility, things that we should all support, to bring you this program. But in those days, it was just one camera on there, and they were supposed to be not serving just a campus. They were supposed to be serving the entire New York metropolitan area, just at NET, and the entire country with public broadcasting. So they needed money. That's why you needed it. In 1967, the Carnegie Commission met and issued a report about educational television. And in that report, they had some findings which led to the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. And again, I remind you, there's Mr. Rogers up in the heavens. We miss Mr. Rogers. He was a great guy. Okay, next please. Change please. Oh, no, not you. Or them. Back one. Thank you. Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, please.
Go to the public broadcasting site.
There you go. Thank you. Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. If you watch PBS, if you watch any of the shows on there, you'll see that this something.
10 minutes till break.
Thank you. Corporation for Public Broadcasting. As opposed to the FCC, all 5 members of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting can be from the same political party. This was done back then. They didn't anticipate all the political infighting that they were going to get, and they got some, believe me. But what they did was they made a semantic change that really impacted the whole entity, and that was ETV, educational television, became public television. This meant that instead of creating a classroom, what public television meant was encompassed political stuff, documentaries, dance, opera, the whole 9 yards, the PBS that we know today. But so it wasn't ETV, it became public television. But if you notice, it's public television at this point. But what it didn't do was establish a method for long-range financial support for public broadcasting. This, again, is a continuation of a pattern, continuation of a way of doing things that they have been doing for a number of years, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. Next, please. Now, what the people at the CPB discovered very quickly was that trying to be all things to all people involved in public television was not good. So what they decided to do was they split the assignments. They separated the corporation from public broadcasting and separated it away and created that as the funding source and established something called the PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service, which is the operator of interconnected facilities, aka the programming network. And we're going to talk about that probably after the break because we only have about 7 minutes until we break, and what that means. And this creation of the PBS and separation of the creative side and the creative and distribution side and the funding source starts a years-long battle between different entities at the organization. Now, within the organization, though, what it really came down to was money. The battle between local stations and national stations, between different ways of doing things. And the battle is best personified by the battle between those who wanted to do educational television and those who wanted to do instructional television. And once again, I'm so happy I can do this because it actually justifies and rationalizes my degree in educational media and technology. Educational television deals with a broad swath of material. It's not very specific. It educates people about a large entity or cornucopia of knowledge. ITV is very, very specific and instructive. So, for example, today when I'm telling you all this stuff, I am educating you. I'm giving you a wide swath, I'm coming across there, of material that doesn't tell you how to do something. Whereas instructional television or instruction might be, how do you install a computer program on your computer? So, step 1, turn on computer. Step 2, take out flash drive. Step 3, insert flash drive into USB port. It's very specific. On Sesame Street, for example, ETV would be an example of going up and going down, or telling people how to, about a country. Whereas ITV might be learning how to count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and things like that. So you end up with that. But the money side of this discussion, if you do ETV, you can do one program and that's it. You cover everything you need to cover. If you do ITV, and that doesn't cost as much money, because when you do ITV and you're instructing somebody, it might be a series of 10 shows covering the instruction. And if that's the case, then it's going to cost a lot of money to produce. The people who are the programmers on the PBS side wanted ITV. They wanted instruction. They wanted more programming. They wanted to fill the time. The people who were from the CPB wanted education and things like that, and fewer programs that cost less money. This battle went on for about 4 years, and the PBS, with its ITV, emerged from the fight as an arm of the local station interests. And that creates a very unique situation with PBS as a network vis-a-vis all the other networks. In 1979, Carnegie II called for a number of items which would strengthen public television, including more federal support. But in 1980, the Reagan and Bush administrations came in and wanted to cut money from it. The GOP Congress of the late 90s and early 21st century wanted to eliminate funding for public broadcasting. And now, as I've mentioned at the top of this, the Trump administration wants to eliminate all funding for public broadcasting. Change, please. There are 4 types of PBS stations. There's the state or local government, which is the largest category, such as Indiana Public Broadcasting, and I love it when I go up to Vermont. Vermont and New Hampshire both still call themselves ETV, educational television, still from the old days, and it's really good, and they stay local government. Second is colleges and universities. There are a great station in Indiana, Ball State University, where our the associate dean of Sky, Daphne Lemish, just came to us from Southern Illinois University, where at Southern Illinois University, they have a PBS television station. The community, which probably is the most known around here, WNET, Channel 13 in New York, WETA in Washington, WHYY in Philadelphia, are community stations. And then there are public school system stations. We have some alums who are out in the Midwest, in one of the Dakotas, who have said that they know of PBS stations that are in an elementary school out there. Well, the reason they were sent there was because that was the only building out there at the time. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to break, and we're going to pick it up from here when we get back from break, because they've told me that they want to go to break. Right. So.
Do you want to improve or strengthen your writing skills? Do you think about getting published one day? If you are an aspiring writer, come to the first ever Rutgers Writers Conference. At this event, you can personally meet established agents, writers, and publishers. For more fun, join in on a panel discussion that takes a close look at publishing options. Listen to a popular author Dennis Lehane's presentation, and much more. This event will take place at the Rutgers Continuing Education Center and will take place from June 3rd to June 4th. To register and find out more, you can visit ruwriterscon.rutgers.edu.
As a commuter, it's hard to make connections outside of class.
Tell me about it.
Did you know that there's a place for commuters to meet up between classes?
No, I didn't.
That's right. The Rutgers Commuter Student Organization's primary goal is to serve commuter needs and interests while building a bigger commuter community on campus. Located in the Bush Student Center, the RCSA Commuter Lounge has many appliances that help make commuter lives easier, such as a microwave, a refrigerator, computers, and even a TV. The RCSA also holds events. It's the perfect place to relax, do homework, and make some friends. Don't have classes on Bush? Don't worry. There is a new commuter lounge in the Douglas Student Center as well. The commuter lounges are open every Monday through Thursday from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. and from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Fridays. For more information, visit rcsa.rutgers.edu.
What are you doing? You've been on this couch all weekend. Don't you want to go out and have some fun?
And what exactly am I supposed to do?
And you've been eating these processed foods all day. Aren't you tired of it?
Listen, pal, I gotta eat.
I'm glad you said so. Now that you're out and about, you have plenty of options to satisfy your hunger. If you're feeling retro, try Henry's Diner. You can get a burger, a sandwich, salad, and much more at any time.
Wait. You mean I can get a burger at 9 a.m.?
Yes, you can. You can even satisfy your sweet tooth. Starbucks has the perfect pick-me-up for you. You can order a coffee, cappuccino, frappuccino, and much more. You'll stay refreshed and caffeinated all day long. If you're in the mood for something more exotic, then stop on over to Hojai Asian Fusion.
Well, I am craving an egg roll.
Well, you're in luck, because Hojai Asian Fusion not only serves that, but General Chow's chicken, sweet and sour fish, and bubble tea.
So that sounds great and all. What if I want something quick?
Then go to Kilmer's Market. Kilmer's Market takes eating to a whole new level with healthier food options and meals made just for you. Craving something zesty? Qdoba will melt in your mouth with quesadillas, burritos, tacos, salads, and much more. Reward yourself after class with a delicious dairy treat from 16 Handles. You can choose from 16 flavors and top it off with cookie dough bites, strawberries, or sprinkles. Whether you need a repair or want to buy new, Kite & Key is a store here on campus ready for your tech needs.
One problem. I'm a broke college kid. I can't afford any of this.
Well, no need to fear. Kite & Key has a student discount. You can escape reality for a few hours right here on campus at the Rutgers Cinema. Ticket prices are $7 for students with an ID, and without an ID, it's $9.50.
Hey, thanks for taking me to the Livingston Plaza. I feel much better.
Hey, I'm trying to watch the movie.
For more information on the Livingston Plaza, visit theplaza.rutgers.edu. Get off your couch and go have some fun.
This is Kate. Kate never utilized the many great resources Rutgers has to offer. Now, Kate doesn't have a job. Don't want to end up like Kate? Then you should go to University Career Services. University Career Services provides career-related counseling, resources, and programs to help individuals clarify academic and career goals, establish career plans, develop job search skills, and make successful career transitions. The mission is to build relationships with alumni, employers, and graduate schools to optimize internship, job, and career opportunities. From workshops and webinars to fairs and other recruiter visits, the staff within University Career Services works tirelessly to prepare students and connect them to the world of work. For more information, visit careers.rutgers.edu.
Did you lose your ID? Not sure of what to do? First, send an email to lostcard@aps.rutgers.edu to suspend your card so no one else can use it. Next, visit one of the RU Connection offices to have your lost or stolen ID card replaced. there is an office located on every campus. Rutgers Hall on College Avenue is open Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. The Bush, Cook Douglas, and Livingston campus housing offices are open Monday through Friday from 8:30 to 5 p.m. The Public Safety Card Office is open from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Monday through Fridays. You will need to pay for your new ID with $20 in RU Express. If you don't have RU Express, you can go to the cashier's office next to Rutgers Hall before getting a new ID. Make sure to provide a form of unexpired government-issued photo identification when asking for a new ID. It's that easy to replace your ID. Make sure to keep it in a safe place so you don't lose it again. For more information and a more detailed explanation, visit pst.rutgers.edu/rules.php.
I don't know, man. I don't know if I can run today. I'm really busy and... Wait, what? You're running there? I did not know this. I didn't even know that was a place.
Do you know all the places on campus where you can work out and exercise? Well, we do, and we want to share that with you. Werblin Recreation Center is located on Bush campus on the corner of Frelinghuysen and Bartholomew Road. Werblin has everything from badminton courts to an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The Livingston Recreation Center is located on Road 3 off of Joyce Kilmer Avenue. This center has a full weight room, hosts many different classes, and even has a spa located right inside to help you relax after a tough workout or maybe just a tough exam. The Cook Douglas Recreation Center is located on Beale Road across from the Cook Student Center. This recreation building comes equipped with a fun fitness center, pool, and racquetball courts for those of you who like sports with a little danger. The College Avenue Gym is located directly on College Avenue, right next to the Student Center. This location has multiple gyms and basketball courts, power and conditioning rooms, and is the only location with a rock wall. The Rutgers Fitness Center is located on Easton Avenue on the College Avenue campus. This is the only location that is just a fitness center, so this might be the place for people looking to just work with weights and machines. Rutgers also has multiple bike and walking paths that run throughout all the campuses. You can find a map of all the paths at rudocs.rutgers.edu/bikewalk. Most facilities are open Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. until 11:30 p.m. Weekend hours vary, but you can find out more information about the facilities and their hours at recreation.rutgers.edu.
These clips are inspired by actual events. Don't let this be you. The Rutgers mobile app is an application available for iPhones, iPads, and iPods, as well as Android phones and tablets. Through this app, you are able to access the university in the palm of your hands. On this app, you will find many helpful features, such as university bus schedules, dining hall menus for each campus, operational hours and upcoming events for career services, as well as the Recreation Center's events and hours, and a list of student life events, and more. The app is available at the Apple Store and on Google Play. Download it today. For more information, go to oss.rutgers.edu/mobile.
Welcome back to the 102 Review. I'm Steve Miller. Once again, I would like to remind you, please, if you have any questions, please tweet them in to @WakeUpRutgers, and I'd be very happy to answer them. Okay, let's get down to this because we have about 45 minutes left to do this one and the cable lecture. What I was saying to you before the break was that there's been a move over the last 30 years by certain political entities to eliminate funding for public broadcasting. And as I mentioned, the Trump administration's done it, but it happened here in New Jersey first. In 2011, Governor Christie sold NJN to New York-based WNET and NJN Radio to WNYC, NHYY in New York and Philadelphia. And the operations were given to as the son of a New Jersey political ally. The claim by Governor Christie was that it broke the budget to have this in there, except it was $8 million plus it gave up a $2.2 million federal subsidy. 120 workers lost their jobs. And New Jersey now has no public broadcasting entity that is licensed to somebody in New Jersey. There's no non-commercial voice in the state, and we are without that. By the way, as a side note, there are no over-the-air television stations whose license is read by this state. WOR, My 9 in New York, is supposed to be, even though because it's based in Secaucus, but they are owned by a company in New York State. Please change. Then there's National Public Radio. National Public Radio is divided into the haves and the have-nots. In order to be a have, you must meet certain CPB requirements to get funding and have a say in national policy. NPR produces its own programming. Now, this is different than what we talked about before in terms of PBS. NPR produces its own programming and distributes it, while local stations produce the PBS TV stuff and PBS distributes. So again, the NPR is a top-down traditional type of thing where, in addition to American Public Radio, in addition to American Public Media, in addition to all the other entities that give to it, they have a distribution network that starts on top from Washington or LA, or Culver City, California, and sends it out across the nation. Whereas PBS has it produced by local stations, sent up to the PBS, and then out. So it works in reverse. And then all TV stations are eligible for money and have a say in national policy, while not all radio stations while not all radio stations must meet CPB requirements. If they don't meet those CPB requirements, they have no say in what's going on. We can skip that. NPR News is the best in the USA. The future of public broadcasting. In 2010, people who were running public media asked for more money from the federal government and in order to build out. And they asked the question, or they put forth the following statement, which is at the bottom here, which is, the American people need such an extraordinary public media system. Our democracy depends on it. The report recommended the government make larger investments in public media, support the efforts, and incorporate newer technologies, online and social media. But, change please. And this is the CPB, change please. What's happened is that they want to eliminate all federal funding for public media and its attack on the marketplace of ideas. It needs more money, not less. A democracy is only as free as its ability to communicate ideas. It's up to you whether or not, we're not cable yet. A democracy is only as free as its ability to communicate ideas. It's up to you. Because without you, we won't have a public media which is not, or any media that is not commercially dependent, where the corporations that sponsor these programs have a say in what the content of these programs are, or the content is, sorry. It's important to understand that the future of the interaction and the intersection of differing positions, differing ideas, coming from differing cultures and neighborhoods. The diversity of our media depends on having an outlet like public media. Okay, as opposed to, now we can go to cable, which, as you see by the screen behind me, I call the ultimate consumer ripoff. Because it is the only, cable and satellite are the only sanctioned monopoly, cable specifically, the only sanctioned monopoly by the federal government. But before we go, here are some definitions you really do need to know in order to understand not only the lecture, but may have to know for the exam. A franchise. Franchise is granted by the town. It's the distributor of programs to the community. It's Cablevision, Comcast, and those type of entities which are contracted with the various towns and cities to put out the programs. The programs are produced by programmers. Those are the TV stations. HBO, Showtime, NBC, ABC, CNN. They send their programs via satellite to the franchise, which then distributed via coaxial cable. Where I stand right now, for all intents and purposes, is a franchise. The RUTV network franchise. This studio at Winkler Dormitory is run by the RUTV Rutgers Television Cable Network. This is a local origination channel. We're going to talk about LOs in a minute. Change. Penetration. Please, again, keep your minds clean. It's a term used when detailing the number of homes that cable service reaches. As of July 2016, wired cable penetration was 54.4%, down for the second straight year because of people like you cutting the cord. Pay-per-view. Pay-per-view is paying on a per-showing basis, as opposed to a subscription, which is subscribing to a pay cable programmer on a long-term basis. There's basic cable, which is all the stations you get automatically when you sign up. There are subscription stations like HBO, which you pay for by the month. It's in addition to your basic cable. And then pay-per-view, which is paying on a per-showing basis. The difference, again, between pay-per-view and subscription is akin to magazines. If you go to the Barnes & Noble and you buy Sports Illustrated, one time for that week, it's a pay-per-view. If you then take out that piece of cardboard, write in to get a subscription to it for a year long or 2 years or 5 years, that's a subscription basis. Video on demand, VOD, is the next step in the technology after pay-per-view. It allows you, the user, to select and watch, listen to video content whenever you want. It's a technological successor to traditional pay-per-view programming. Now, instead of pay-per-view where it's a one-shot deal that you buy the pay-per-view and you watch it Saturday night at 9 o'clock and it's the only time you can watch it, or whenever they schedule reruns, video on demand allows you to watch TV or watch a show whenever you want it, however you want it, in whatever method you want it. Video on demand, Hulu is a complete VOD setup. My daughters, when it was on, watched How I Met Your Mother, not at 8 o'clock on Monday nights on CBS, but through whatever means necessary. It could have been at 3 in the morning on a Wednesday. So that's VOD, and it's a very popular thing. The other thing about VOD, in terms of the changing technologies, is that it's different than what existed in earlier eras, because in earlier eras you had to watch, as I call it, it was called appointment television. If something was on at 8 o'clock on Monday night, you only could watch at 8 o'clock Monday night. Then VCRs came along. Then now you have VOD when you can watch it anytime, and it's completely blown up the whole paradigm. The universe, it's the number of homes which can get a pay-per-view program. Not all cable homes can get pay-per-view, and that describes the universe in which that pay-per-view broadcast is going. And the buy rate is the percentage of universe homes, I keep forgetting to put that S in there, which purchased a pay-per-view program. If 100 million people are eligible to receive a pay-per-view event and 5 million homes get it, that's 5% of the universe for a single event. That is a big, great, fantastic buy rate. The box, and when they decide to, can you go closer on the PowerPoint for a moment? Okay, if you look at that box in the right-hand corner, that was the original cable box that enabled you to change your channels. As I told you in class, the thing that was most interesting about it had a long wire which allowed you to sit in your chair and stay in your chair and not have to get up out of your chair to change the channels. But this was the original hookup to the television from the cable company, which allowed you to switch channels. And now there's a new type of box, which is called a set-top box, which allows you to get all your digital channels through there, get your subscription through there. the dish. It's a satellite dish. In a home environment, it's only a receiver. As of 2016, 30.3% of all households had satellite television and other alternative delivery systems. But that means when you add the 54%, approximately 54.5% to the dish's 30.5%, you have 85% of the country getting either satellite or cable or choosing that. But the other 15%, which is up a full 5% in the past couple of years, are choosing not to get satellite or cable. That is amazing. And again, it's you guys cutting the cord. And again, of course, the definition of cable marketing, according to Phil Mushnick of the New York Post, is lying. Skip this. We don't need to know this. Monthly subscriber fees. Last week, ESPN cut 100 workers from their budget, including some of their most well-known anchors and reporters. It looks like the bubble is burst on ESPN, but yet, as of 2014, they were charging $6.04 per subscription every month. And at the time, we'll average out at 100 million subscriptions. They were getting in $600 million a month just from cable subscription, forgetting about the advertising, forgetting about everything. But now, with the decline in the number of cable subscriptions and the number of ESPN subscribers out there, which is now about 92 million, that's the reason why they've had to cut workforce, because they don't have the money anymore because people are cutting the cord and moving away. Cable television was, I don't know if anybody in their right mind back in the 1940s, when the first idea for cable came about, could ever have envisioned the multi-trillion-dollar behemoth that it would become. Originally, it was something known as CATV, Community Antenna Television. As legend has it, there was a town in western Pennsylvania that was located amongst various mountain ranges and couldn't receive over-the-air television signals well. So a hardware store owner allegedly had something called coaxial cable, RF cable. That's the cable that has that little piece of wire that comes out of the cable that you screw into the back of your cable connection. And that carried clear audio and video signals. Now, the idea was that the local government would run it, thus the idea of the local government signing a contract for its city with a franchise to cablecast to the community. In return for this opportunity, the franchise had to pay the city about 5% of its gross. So if they were charging $10 a month for cable, 50 cents per month per household went to the city. Change, please. Now, at the time, the original methods of getting a signal or augmenting a signal into a community were the following. One, cable companies could import distant signals into the viewing area. Here in Central Jersey, Cablevision was not the company. The company was called TKR Cable when I moved here in the late 80s. And they received distant signals from and were broadcasting WSBK Channel 38 from Boston, Channel 17 and 29 from Philadelphia, and they brought them into the area. So that was called the import of distant signals into the viewing area. Local origination. As I said to you before, I'm here on RUTV. We're channel 23.4? Okay. Well, there were no .4s in the days prior to digital distribution. So, but this is the local origination station. It's run by your local Rutgers cable company and produces programs like this, like Wake Up Rutgers, like all the other things that you watch on this station, and you should be watching on this station because you have to support local media, especially campus media. TKR had something called Channel 6, and they ran shows like So You Want to Be a Gambler, where they said, so this is a roulette wheel. You put bets on either black or red and your number. And they did that for a half hour. And then, of course, subscription stations like HBO and Showtime and Cinemax. Now, the government at first, the federal government, did not get involved. But as time went on, more and more cable systems were importing distant signals. Now, that meant that interstate communication was taking place, and that fell under the FCC's jurisdiction. Also, as more and more cable companies realized that they could make a lot of money doing this, the broadcasters, the over-the-air broadcasters of so-called free TV, were getting angry. So they petitioned the FCC to put in some rules that would limit and curtail the extent of power that the cable companies were having. Their first intervention was in 1962, and in 1966 they put in the first FCC rules that were implicitly assigned to the cable companies. The first one was the must-carry rule. Must-carry rule stated that cable companies were required to carry all stations on their cable box that a consumer could receive over the air in that viewing area. Number two was that public hearings had to be held if a cable system was importing a signal and the cable system was in one of the top 100 markets. Two things that really angered the cable companies. Number one, these were rules that were being imposed on them by the government, and the cable companies felt that the government was telling them how to run their business. So for the must-carry rule, here in the New York metropolitan area, right here in Piscataway and New Brunswick, there were 14 over-the-air stations that the TKR was required to carry. They only had 36 slots on the box. So you're talking about 40% approximately of all stations that were being carried by the cable company were being dictated to them by the federal government. The signal import public hearing thing meant that the cable company had to spend money on this idea, and their competitors did not have to do that. The cable companies took the government to court, took the FCC to court, and the FCC won in the Southwestern cable case of 1968. Change, please. But again, this brings back the same debate that we talked about earlier with what is government overreach? What is the right of the government? What can the government do in terms of what they should or should not be regulated? And the question is, should the cable industry be regulated? Those who argue no believe that cable represented an outmoded technology artificially propped up by the FCC and the federal government, that they were just serving the political interests of the National Association of Broadcasters and the over-the-air broadcasters. Those who argued yes, that cable should be regulated, said that unrestrained growth led to the consumer paying for programming he or she had been getting for free. This idea of paying for programming that you once got for free is best personified by pay-per-view programming. Pay-per-view programming, now go back to me please, don't put that one up yet. Or you can put that background, that's fine. Pay-per-view programming deals with the idea, no that's fine, leave that. Leave that one, thank you. Pay-per-view programming has programming on it that when I was young, we did not have to pay an extra dollar for. We watched Muhammad Ali's fights. We watched professional wrestling. There was no such thing as MMA or UFC back in the day. And what the argument against this is that you can get ripped off on pay-per-view, and people have. But the other side of it says that if somebody wants to pay for extra money for a program, they should be allowed to, and also the business people should be allowed to run programming that can earn them extra money. So the question remains whether or not pay-per-view is something, but also what is government overreach, whether or not, and that's the bigger question in this. Now you can go to the next one. No, not you, the other one. And these are the top pay-per-view events of all time, and they've made a boatload of money. The Pacquiao-Mayweather fight grossed over $400 million on pay-per-view alone. WrestleMania in 2012 had 1.3 million buys, and they had a $67 million worldwide gross. One thing I'm going to point out to you, and it's not going to be on the test, but I just want to point out to you, is dealing with the WWE network, which is blowing pay-per-view out of the water, because what it's doing is it's streaming all its programming. The Vince McMahon and his family made a conscious decision to get away from all pay-per-view programming in terms of traditional pay-per-view, and now only really have a pay-per-view for WrestleMania. They have decided to sacrifice $29.95 a month and bet that the 1.6 million subscribers to this network are going to enable them to survive and make just as much money, if not more. It's a very interesting gamble, but it's a very modern risk that they're taking. So it's a very significant change in the way programming is distributed. And it's something that we're going to talk about a little more later. Okay. In 1972, things started to change and go the other way. The FCC was receiving more and more complaints, even with the 1966 rules, and they decided to put even stricter rules and enforce them. The first rule that, again, was must carry. Then they decided to limit the number of distant import signals into an area to only 3 network stations, whereas before people could import as many as they wanted, 1 or 2 independent stations, and any number of subscription stations. They also required that each cable system have an education, a local government, and a public access channel. What does this mean? It meant that instead of 14, now there were 22 stations out of 36, 22 slots out of 36 on the cable box that the government was telling the cable companies to program. Cable companies, they were livid. So they started doing what the over-the-air broadcasters were doing, which is they started putting money toward lobbying the politicians. And this led to what became known as the Cable Television Report and Order, which deregulated cable's expansion into new markets and paved the way for subscription networks, or for more cable networks. So HBO, which was first in the 1970s, which, by the way, was started out of Madison Square Garden as a sports network in the early 70s. But then the Cable Television Report and Order laid the groundwork for the first superstation, which was WTBS, owned by Ted Turner, thus TBS, Turner Broadcasting System. Showtime came in 78, ESPN in 79, CNN in 80, and people got their MTV in 1981. This all came about because the cable companies were allowed to expand into new markets and expand their reach into other things. And this was a battle. But then the cable company fought back even more by suing the FCC again. And the subject this time was something to do with copyright fees, but also that HBO claimed the FCC had exceeded its jurisdiction in limiting programming options and was treating cable differently. The court said that cable television resembled newspapers more than broadcast and deserved similar First Amendment protection. Sorry, can't speak anymore. And the court said that the FCC was treating cable like it was a second-class citizen. This led to the Cable Communications Policy Act of 1984, which is the first act dealing with cable that really made it anti-consumer. It was probably the most important anti-consumer legislation in the history of media. It said that fair competition existed if 3 over-the-air stations or signals were available in the viewing area. It didn't matter whether or not you could see those stations well or their picture well. And it made deregulation the law for 97% of the country and took away almost all consumer rights and gave the power to the cable companies. This was best personified and best represented, how much this killed the consumer, in a case study we're now going to look at. This deals with Madison Square Garden Network versus Cablevision. Now, let me preface this by saying, at the time, Cablevision, which is, by the way, no longer Cablevision, it was sold last year, but Cablevision did not own Madison Square Garden Network at the time. The players in this, there was no Yes Network also. The players in this were George Steinbrenner, CEO and managing partner of the New York Yankees. And again, I will say this, as much as it kills me, the New York Yankees are the world's most famous sports franchise. Charles Dolan, CEO of Cablevision Systems. He's the founder of it. Cablevision at the time was the largest cable company in the New York metropolitan area. Based in Long Island, it controlled Long Island, parts of Connecticut, Jersey, and New York State. Bob Gutkowski, the VP of Madison Square Garden Network. Madison Square Garden Network was what was known as an RSN, a regional sports network. WPIX Channel 11, an independent TV station in New York, which had been carrying the Yankees from 1948 until this time on all games. And then what was up for on WPIX Channel 11, and then up for grabs were the Yankee TV rights. What happened was that Cablevision approached the Yankees with the plan that you now see on the screen, said that it wanted a 10-year contract between the Yankees and Cablevision to run the games on a pay station known as Sports Channel New York and it was 100 games on free TV from 78 to 82 and 50 games on Sports Channel. And then that proposal would be reversed starting from 1983 through 1987. What happened was that at the beginning of this contract, before Steinbrenner signed it, he said to Dolan, cable penetration stinks. They don't even get cable around Yankee Stadium, and you want me to sign with you. And Dolan said, don't worry, we're going to improve it by the time the second 5 years comes around. The deal was that Steinbrenner and the Yankees would receive a nickel for every new subscriber to Sports Channel. So Steinbrenner, taking Dolan at his word, signed the contract. Except by 1983, cable penetration was minimal. It was not good at all. And so Steinbrenner went to Dolan and said, I want to keep the Yankees 100 games on free TV. Dolan said, no, I'm sorry. You signed this contract. That's what you get. So I'm sure Steinbrenner probably said, don't worry, he'll get his. In September of 1987, in middle of 1987, Steinbrenner announced that he was opening the bidding for the Yankee TV rights for beginning with 1987. Cablevision and MSG both came back with the same bid. 12 years, $500 million. Leave this here. No, don't change. Thank you. While Steinbrenner and his team looked over the bids and were trying to decide, Dolan approached Gutkowski. Gutkowski was the vice president of Madison Square Garden Network. Madison Square Garden Network was a basic station which came as part of everybody's basic cable package. He also had a problem. He had what was known as a donut schedule. A donut schedule. He had two big franchises, the New York Rangers hockey team and the New York Knickerbockers basketball team. Both of those teams played starting in October and hopefully played through the spring if they made the playoffs, all the way until May or June. But the hole in the schedule, which is why it was known as a donut, was the fact that he had no summer programming. In New York, Gutkowski was running tractor pulls, rodeos, and sports programming that really didn't fit into what he wanted. So he really needed the Yankees. Except Dolan approached him not as the person who was the head of Sports Channel, the programmer competing against him for the Yankee rights. He approached him as the head of Cablevision, the franchise, and said to him, Bob, Madison Square Garden Network doesn't make enough money for us. We want you to go to becoming a subscription station. If you don't, we are pulling you from our cable boxes. Gutkowski said, no, I'm not doing that. You have a contract. You have to run us. Dolan said, I will pull you. Gutkowski said, let's see you do it. And he did it. The reason why Dolan approached Gutkowski in September was it was just before the beginning of the Rangers and Knicks seasons, and that's when they made their money. So Dolan and Cablevision pulled Madison Square Garden Network, and there was a black hole and the spot on your box. Consumers were livid. Why? Not only weren't they getting their Madison Square Garden Network, they also were being charged for that black hole. Cablevision did not give them a refund for the per channel subscription or per channel payment they were making. Consumers went to the Better Business Bureau. They appealed to the government. They appealed to their representatives. And they were told, sorry kids, no can do. You have no rights under the Cable Communications Act of 1984, and the cable company has the right to do whatever they want, and you have to continue paying. That was the power of the Cable Communications Act and what power it took away from the consumer. So all this was going on September, October, November. End of November, beginning of December, Steinbrenner announces the winner of the bid, Madison Square Garden Network. Cablevision loses it, Madison Square Garden wins. So, January, February, spring training's about to come on. Madison Square Garden Network still is not on Cablevision. March, Dolan calls up Gutkowski and says, Bob, I still want you to become a subscription. Congratulations, you have the money. You have the Yankee bid. Gutkowski says, no, we're not going to do that. Well, we're at an impasse. What do we do? Well, one of them came up with what they thought was a brilliant idea. Why don't we, instead of making Madison Square Garden a subscription station, raise the basic rates for the consumers who have Madison Square Garden? Better yet, let's get all the cable companies to raise the rates on all the consumers in the New York metropolitan area to make up for that. And that's exactly what happened. So Cablevision was able to get an increase in cable rates and still make money. So, what does this all mean? Well, in this deal, there are winners and there are losers. Steinbrenner and the Yankees received $43 million before one pitch was thrown. They're a winner. Cablevision and Dolan, they lost the rights, but the basic fees increased, and so they're a winner. Not only that, the $500 million that they could have used to that they would have used for the Yankee games, they now could use for something else. And oh gee, I wonder what they do. Oh yeah, they bought Madison Square Garden Network eventually, the Rangers and Knicks, so they used that money for that. Madison Square Garden and Gutkowski, they filled in the donut. They're a winner. WPIX. As I mentioned in class, WPIX was able to get the broadcast rights to 50 Yankee games because the Madison Square Garden and Gutkowski realized that they had overpaid for the rights and they couldn't afford to do it without doing that. So WPIX paid Madison Square Garden Network for the rights to broadcast those Yankee games. If you are a sports fan and you watch the Mets or Yankees on Channel 9 whenever they're shown there, those are the same 50 Yankee games that aren't shown on Yes or aren't shown on national TV. They're now on, they're on Channel 9. And of course, in the end, the losers are we, the consumers. Here's one of the things you have to understand. And this is probably, if there's a lesson you learn in all this, it's that the trickle-down effect on any media properties or on any media purchases is that we, the people, we, the consumers, end up paying for all this. In order to make the money back that they bid on the Yankees, Madison Square Garden Network had to raise their advertising rates to the Budweisers, to the Ford cars, and Budweiser and Ford are not going to stand idly by and have to pay more money and lose their profit margin. So they're going to increase the price on their beer and their cars. So then in the end, we're really paying that $43 million per year for the Yankees' rights. But here's the important thing to also note. This isn't just of that time change. This has happened in recent years in the battle between Food Network and Cablevision. Scripps Network wanted an increase in their fee payments from 25 cents to $1. Cablevision didn't want to do it. because people wanted to, because Scripps wanted to capitalize on the new foodie networks and all the foodies that are out there. You know, all these people who want to watch Chopped and Iron Chef and Rutgers graduate Mario Batali and all of his shows. But instead of just pulling the networks this time, which was HGTV and Food Network, what Cablevision did was they filled that black spot with commercials they produced chastising Food Network and HGTV and the Scripps Network for being greedy bastards. And that's what they did. And so instead, if you flipped on that spot, you got to watch these bad commercials against them. So, I'm sorry?
15 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. So it's important to understand that the consumers lost again because the increase went in there. And then the cable companies, especially Cablevision, in order to compensate for what are known as retransmission fees and to make up their money on retransmission fees, what the cable companies then do is increase the rates that they charge the consumer for that money. So if Scripps wanted to go from 25 cents to $1, they didn't just increase the price of basic cable by 75 cents, they increased it by $1 so the cable company could get an extra 25 cents so they could cover it that way. It's the same fight that's being done, that was done with Time Warner Cable, which is now Spectrum and CBS, and DirecTV and the Weather Channel. So it's happening with satellites too. Change, please. Thank you. The 1984 Communications Act went over like a lead balloon with consumers. So by 1991, there was such a hue and cry that the FCC changed the number of signals that were necessary for this to happen from 3 to 6. And in 1992, the Cable Consumer Act of 1992 was passed by Congress and vetoed by George H.W. Bush. But it was so important that consumers get this in an election year that this was the only law that President George H.W. Bush vetoed that was overridden by Congress and by 77 to 23 vote, and it went into law, went into effect. Except that while this law was being lobbied, the cable companies and its network partners went together and colluded to circumvent the law's intent. So what they did was, at the time, the cable companies increased the number of stations they could have on their trunks, on their cable boxes, and then they, at a discounted rate to the networks, gave them the space for CNBC, MSNBC, ESPN2, Fox, FX, and things like that. At around between 1992 and 1998, there's a drastic increase in the number of cable boxes, of stations on your cable box, and that are taken up by that. This was done to circumvent the law's intent when they wanted to impose that copyright fee, that dreaded copyright fee, which never seems to be imposed. Something seems to happen with that all the time. In 1996, the Telecom Act came about, and consumers were hit even harder. As I mentioned in class, there is actually one of the regulations, I believe it's in Section 108, states, in different language, of course, because it's all arcane legal language, it states that if the town of Piscataway signs a contract with Cablevision today for 5 years, as soon as the ink is dry, Cablevision can shut off all distribution of cable in the town for the length of that contract, and the consumers can do nothing about it. And then since that time, as I pointed out, even today, with this way of circumventing the ownership regulations, FCCs and Congress are allowing the media giants to get bigger and your choices to get fewer and fewer. Change, please. The cable consolidation continues. Charter Communications purchased Time Warner for $55 billion in Bright House, and now they are made themselves the second largest cable company in the country. Time Warner is now Spectrum, and you're going to see all these Spectrum commercials. As you all know, I'm a Mets fan, and I watch the Mets religiously, and I'm sick to death of the Spectrum commercials that are being broadcast on the Met games. But they're on because they're trying to get publicity for the new brand and get the new brand out there. As you saw in the John Oliver thing, and as you saw, and I've talked to you in class, Charter, Time Warner, Comcast, cable ranks at the bottom. in terms of customer satisfaction surveys and as customer popularity surveys. They are ranked lower than politicians, than all other media, because they treat their consumers badly. AT&T purchased DirecTV for $48.5 million. That made them the largest multi-channel service provider. And Comcast remains the #1 most subscribed to cable company. This was done under the Obama administration, which allowed these large mega mergers to go through to the detriment of the consumer. And the consumers are the ones who end up paying for all of this. Change, please. Now, people are asking about competition. My wife asked me the other day whether or not we'd be better off if we got Fios. But Comcast, first of all, Comcast, DirecTV, and Dish Network control the video distribution industry. DirecTV wanted to merge with Dish, but it was squashed by the FCC a few years ago. But the same people who own Dish who own DirecTV, News Corp, have a stake in Dish also. So it's the same owners that are in there. I don't know if you remember when you were in high school, and I don't know if you learned this, but I remember this vividly when I was in high school. At the turn of the 20th century, when the era of the robber barons, there were all these antitrust laws put into effect. And one of the things that was banned was something called interlocking directorates. Interlocking directorates were when a member of one company that was on the board of one company was prevented from serving on the board of a competitor. That happens all the time in the cable industry, and it's allowed, and it's just not right. Telephone companies offer little hope. They offer the same high pricing and the same programming. As I said, it's trust-like partnership, and there's little hope in sight for us. And, as I called it the multiplex problem. The people who, it's like trying to go to any of the multiplexes in the area. In South Plainfield, at at Hadley Plaza, at Regal in South Brunswick, Regal in North Brunswick, at Brunswick Square Mall, and at Lowe's. We have 4 different 18 movie theaters, yet you get the same movies all over the place. That's what cable is. You are the hope for the consumer. You have made the choice to cut the cord. The number of cable households dropped below 100 million for the first time in years during the fourth quarter of 2015. Through the third quarter of last year, of 2016, 1.3 million subscribers cut the cord. Broadcast has only increased to 11.6% of the homes because you're watching on Amazon, you're watching Hulu, Netflix, streaming services. You're choosing what is known as a la carte services, such as HBO Go, which means that you're subscribing to HBO Go without subscribing to a cable company. And that's what making a change. Sony, CBS, and HBO, as I said, is trying to do it. You may never subscribe to cable. You may never subscribe to that. Wi-Fi enables you to do different things, and it's important. Change, please. And if you look at this charts, the number of households counting the cords over the past 12 months has increased precipitously, and over the past 6-7 years, it's done so also. Now, what's important to understand that the cable companies, the satellite companies, could soon become thing of the past if the trend continues. But what they're doing is they're searching for other ways to make money in the cable industry, in all the industries that we're talking about here today. They're looking for ways to try and get back to that higher profit margin. Now, what are some of the ways that the future holds for us? Sorry, that bad language. But what are some of the things that the future holds for us? Professor John Pavlik talked about that earlier. He talked about, in his lecture, about a changing environment, that we've changed from an environment which has a top-down authoritative type linear system, which is stagnant, that has an authoritative person sitting in front of the camera and just telling you what the news is, to a bottom-up environment, which citizen journalism, non-linear, nothing is static, it's dynamic. And he talked about all of the innovations that are happening out there in the new media environment. He talked about Moore's law, which said that the power of transistors, back when Moore was talking about this, increased power and speed every 18 months. Well, I argue to you that we're now in the era of more on speed, more on steroids, because everything changes, and you know this every minute of every day. It seems as if the moment that you buy your new technology, the moment that you find a new piece of journalism, the moment that you find a new media entity, it's obsolete. Does anybody do Vines anymore, for example? There's no such thing as MySpace anymore. The best example in terms of the changing technology, in 2003, CDs were what everybody used for music. By 2004, when the iPod came about, the entire music industry was blown out of the water. So Professor Pavlik was stressing all of these things in his lecture, that it's a changing media environment, and through the use of newer technologies like drones and virtual reality, what is news going to come and where is news going to come? The other thing he talked about was the concept of fake news. And I argue to you there's a difference between, and this is me, argue the difference between fake news and false news. There's been I will argue that fake news has happened forever, whether it be Jon Stewart, Howard Stern's Robin Quivers, or even going back to the early 1960s with a show called That Was the Week That Was. But it's the false news that gets everybody. And the impact of false news has been documented and is going to continue to be documented. But the future of media, as we talked about in the last lecture, deals with you. And it deals with, yes, not just Facebook, not just the fact that because of the advent of cell phone technology, that revolutions will never happen in silence again. It has to deal with you and the choices you are going to make in the future as cable consumers, as media consumers. Because if you stop buying a product or stop using one like Vine, or like if people in your age group stop using Instagram or Twitter, then it might fall apart, because these companies are only looking for ways to which they can make money. If you stop buying it, especially you in the 18 to 25-year-old consumer group, 18 to 29 really, with ones allegedly with disposable income, then they're going to stop making the products and they're going to stop pushing those products. So the future of media is up to you. Your future in this course is also up to you. So you have to study, you have to ask questions. If you have any questions, please get in touch with me. You have my email address, stmiller@rutgers.edu. If you have any questions and you want to talk to me personally, come to my office hours. I'm going to be there on and off for the next week. I've got meetings. Get in touch with me first, or get in touch with members of the staff. I would also like to say to you, again, it's 100 questions, multiple choice, true, false, being held Wednesday, May 10th, 8 a.m. in Scott 123. I would like to thank my staff members. Henry, you've been great. Henry's been a great TA working with me this semester. I couldn't have done the course without him for both semesters. And also the members of my team who are graduating. Congratulations to them. Lydia, Jessica, Abby, and Jennifer. And I want to also, again, she's going to kill me because I'm mentioning again, I'm going to congratulate Jennifer. Jennifer just got hired an on-air job down in Maryland. So congratulations to Jen. So again, once again, please, if you have any questions, get in touch. And of course, finally, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank all the people here at RUTV, Dan and Z, who are here in the studio with me. I want to thank Chelsea, who's back in the control room, for doing her thing back there, and everybody else who's here, too numerous to name. And I want to thank you, my class, for taking this class this semester. It's been wonderful, and I look forward to seeing you a week from tomorrow at 8 o'clock in Scott 123. Thanks very much. Take care. Goodbye.